How is the system broken? How did we get here?
So I try to describe it as a technological problem first and foremost, but that doesn't necessarily require really deep technical understanding. There's just some key points. And so I kind of separate the financial history into kind of three main eras. So the first era was pre-telegraph. That's when everything was analog. And so there were monetary technologies, things like coinage, things like paper and the printing press. We don't really think of them as technologies today, but at the time they certainly were these new technologies that allowed basically forms of ownership and money to move around quicker and transactions to move around quicker. But once they invented the telegraphs, that was the 1830s, and then by the 1860s, we had cross-Atlantic cables, cross-continental cables, and you could talk almost instantly or send low bandwidth signals almost instantly around the world. And that means you could do transactions almost instantly around the world. And the way that I describe the problem is that opened up a really big mismatch between transaction speeds, which could now just go around the speed of light almost, and settlement speeds, which at the time were still physical gold and other, physical valuables. And the main way that they bridged that gap was to have a big centralized ledger. So either big commercial banks or in many cases a central bank that all the commercial banks build on top of. And that becomes a trusted layer that everybody has to use to bridge between settlements and transactions. And whenever there's a really big centralized honeypot, it's prone to manipulation. It's prone to people misusing it for various reasons and kind of breaking that trust. And the reason I look at that through that technological lens is because I think for the first time in a very long time, that gap is closed because Bitcoin, it represents multiple things, but in this context, it represents the invention of fast settlements. So after basically a century and a half, we finally had the settlement side catch up to the transaction side. And that, of course, took a lot more bandwidth, a lot more inventions that just had to be created over the course of that period of time. And so I would say money's been broken. It's partially because of individuals making decisions. So we can point to, the creation of this central bank or this politician making this decision at this time. Those are all true. But I think the structural underlying problem for why it's basically broken in every single country, and it's been broken for a very long time, is because we've kind of lived through this technological mismatch. And that's made it very hard. Basically, all the incentives in front of politicians and central bankers and policymakers in general erred toward making it very easy for them to break the trust and create problems.
I think that technological perspective is so fascinating. It's one that people don't necessarily think of. They think of, okay, this is some entirely a human-caused problem. And while there are human components to this, of course, decisions that were made, a lot of this is sort of an inevitable path of this mismatch that you describe. And I think maybe in one of these more human-caused problems, though, if I can say that, is this idea of inflation. You mentioned previously money being tied to gold, being tied to something that's a hard asset, something backing the money. A lot of people may still not realize that our money, and if we talk about the United States, hasn't been tied to gold since 1971. And they think of inflation. They hear politicians talking about inflation. They may view it as something that's sort of natural. It's an inconvenience. Prices are going up. Things are getting more expensive. But really, it comes down to the value of your money going down. And so I'm kind of curious, how do you define inflation that is now possible because of this broken system that we have, this unchecked system? And how does that actually impact the everyday person's ability to be able to save, plan for their future, and invest?
So structural inflation, the underlying cause is growth in the money supply on a sustained basis. Now, you can have temporary causes of inflation, of price inflation, things like, for example, a war or a shortage or other, basically anything that harms productivity can make prices go up temporarily in a certain area. They will generally, if the money supply growth itself is not the issue, those prices will come down in time and or they will lower the prices of something else that people aren't buying because they have to prioritize buying this thing that has gone up in price, if it's something core like food or shelter. But in order to get sustained, persistent price increases like we see today and for a very long time, it requires that the money supply itself is increasing. That's an axiom that's true everywhere. And that primarily hits us in one of two ways. The way we normally think of it is consumer prices go up, or a typical basket of what a person might buy in a given year that basket is increasing. And they're all happening at different rates. I mean, things like hospital services might be going up faster than the official inflation rates, while things like electronics might actually still be deflating because they're getting more productive even faster than the money supply is growing. And so they actually have a negative inflation rate in some cases. And the mix of all that together is we find that the average price of living a year of our lives, much like last year, is higher, which means that then Americans have to go out and try to get a raise, try to kind of keep up with that. The other way that it can manifest is it can show up in asset price inflation, which is normally not very captured in consumer prices. But basically, when you have a period of rapid money supply growth, but also pretty high productivity growth, so if the economy is doing a pretty good job of keeping, energy well supplied and other goods and services flowing pretty readily, then, not all of that money supply growth is going to necessarily show up in prices at the same rate. And a lot of that surplus will show up in things like equity prices, housing prices, gold going up and kind of capturing some of that, maybe the modern era Bitcoin now. But looking at history, we basically any of these more monetary type of assets that are primarily owned by the wealthier, the upper middle class and the middle class, those assets tend to capture a lot of that growth. But then that can make it harder for new entrants to want to buy those assets, which is particularly relevant for housing. So at the end of the day, it all comes back down to money supply growth, because that's a necessary part of, if we see inflation like on a persistent basis, it has to be because the money supply itself is also growing.
And, you mentioned this asset inflation, which I think is really not often fully understood by people. They think inflation, they think consumer prices going up, my eggs at the grocery store, my ground beef, whatever it might be. But they often don't think about just houses. Like, houses are such a great example. You've got the boomer generation that, as the joke goes, bought their house for a handful of strawberries back in the early 70s, and their house is now worth millions of dollars. And meanwhile, you've got millennials, Gen Z, even some younger Gen X who feel like they just they won't ever be able to afford a home. Is this kind of why there's this general feeling of it's harder and harder to get ahead? I can't possibly save enough. This realization that, okay, asset prices, which I don't own a lot of as a younger person, are just running away from me. And you're never able to kind of catch up to that. You're never able to feel that you get ahead. Is that where you think this general sense comes from? It's just this misunderstanding of the fact that that is still inflation. It's just a different kind of inflation.
Yeah, I think that's a really big factor. I think when we look at a couple key things like house price inflation, as well as other big expenses like healthcare inflation, these things have generally been above trend compared to what we think of as inflation, CPI. And those are some of the biggest expenses that people have. And so back in like the 70s, for example, interest rates were quite high. And so in many cases, saving in bonds, especially by the time they got to the 80s, was considered more attractive. And you wouldn't necessarily want to go out and buy a house just for savings if you're going to pay a mortgage rate of like 10% or higher in many cases. So the average house price was lower, and people primarily looked at them as a utility thing. You need shelter, so you buy a house. As interest rates came structurally down, and as we went through multiple decades of persistent currency debasement and people realizing that if the money's weak, they have to save in other things. They have to monetize other scarcer assets if they want to preserve their purchasing power. One of the key things they go into is real estate. That's in addition to things like equities or gold or other financial assets, but real estate's obviously a very large and popular one. And so people can buy second homes and leave them empty. People can, do all sorts of things, and they're willing to pay pretty high prices because if you're wealthy and you can get a 3% mortgage while money supply is historically growing at 7% a year, many of them will pay up quite a bit for a house and then price out more price sensitive buyers. And so that has been a, pretty persistent issue against the middle class and overall household formation and key metrics like how many hours of work it takes to afford a house. And some people will push back on that and say, well, houses have gotten bigger on average. Then the counter pushback is that they've also in many ways gotten lower quality per square foot. So if you knock on the wall of your new construction today, it's going to sound like balsa wood compared to what a new construction would have been like years ago. And of course, you've gotten better at engineering, so some things work better, of course. But on average, it just takes more work to afford a similar size and quality of house than it did some decades ago, and therefore it often takes two incomes, and people can feel like they're having trouble getting ahead.